Hello and welcome to our Syxsense April Patch Tuesday webinar. Today, we have our industry expert, Rob Brown, here to give us an inside look into the newest Patch Tuesday releases. If you have any questions, please add them to the chat and Rob will reach out after.
Thank you very much, Johanna, and a very warm welcome to everyone today joining us for the April Patch Tuesday webinar. We do have quite a lot to talk about today. There's over the next 30 minutes, we'll be covering some of the most important vulnerabilities for you to address this month, and also to give you some insight into how we can help prioritize the vulnerabilities that you should be deploying using over 10 years of experience of deploying over 100 million updates for our customers worldwide. So thank you very much for joining us today. And before we start, we're just going to cover off some news. There are some quite important things to cover. As you know, we like to set some foundation work in your Microsoft operating system platform. First being that Microsoft has said that Windows 10 will have a supported release until October 14, 2025. Now, if you do look down at your calendar, you'll see that it is quite far away, but we know that it's not really that far away, considering it can sometimes take 6 months to 12 months for a rather large organization to roll out feature updates. So if you are planning on going to Windows 11, please be aware that that end of life is actually relatively short as well. And what's quite interesting is we've seen through some of the news bulletins that Windows 11 was supposed to be released at the end of last month. So beta versions aren't available for you to try Windows 12. So already we're talking about Windows 12. So please, if you have any feedback, if you're considering going to Windows 12, if you've tried it out and you like the interface, send us a message. We'd love to know. We'd love to see how customers and companies around the world are adopting the different operating systems. And potentially, we feel that probably a lot of customers will go from Windows 10 directly to Windows 12. It's quite an anticipated operating system. But please do let us know if you've tried it, if you like it, if you don't like it, what do you like about it and what don't you like it about it. And we'll maybe put that as a spotlight for a future Patch Tuesday webinar. Now, as you know, we'd like to keep close eyes on what has been released by the CISA agency, CISA. They've released a couple of notes for us in the last couple of days. First for Adobe. Now, they have released recommendations for the deployment of all of these Adobe software updates. These are what they call priority 3, which actually is the lower of the priorities, which means you have about 4 weeks to roll these out. And interestingly enough, there is actually an Adobe Acrobat and Reader update right in the middle there, APSB 23-24, that they're recommending that you deploy as well. We haven't had one of those for a couple of months. There isn't anything in this list that we are aware or CISA is aware that is being weaponized. So just roll these out in your usual patching strategy. For Mozilla, there are 3 updates for Mozilla. We talk about the Windows Firefox version 112. There is a Firefox ESR 102.10 and Thunderbird 102.10 as well. They've been recommended to be deployed within the next 4 weeks as well. To our knowledge, nothing in Mozilla Firefox from a browser perspective or an email perspective has been weaponized at this point. So standard strategy should exist for these to roll them out within the next 4 weeks. As we turn our sights over to the Microsoft, we actually did have a ton of updates released yesterday. So we had just under 100 updates, 8 critical, 90 were important. And if you've followed us on our last webinar, we talked about this PostScript and PCL6 class printer driver. Now we had 9 fixes in the last release. We've now got 12 fixes in this one. And I just want to recap why this is important. to note of all of the vulnerabilities that are being fixed, because it's very important that we know what Microsoft have done in the past to understand where you should be adapting your testing strategy in the future. And this happens to be something that we've learned quite closely over the print nightmare, why we want to pay extra attention in printing, especially if you do a lot of printing in your organization. Now, there are two types of printer. I'll just recap. There is a PostScript printer. This is a generic printer driver that comes with Windows. And a PostScript printer is where you typically send the entire print job to the printer. So these are typically printers that sit on desks. They're very popular. If you're doing anything, if you're working in retail or potentially in hospitality, you might have a printer and you need to print directly to it. That's called a PostScript printer. And then there's another type which is very popular as well, called a PCL6, which stands for the printer command language. And this is a different type of printer driver that sends each line of text, or if you're sending a picture or printing out a receipt, it sends each line one at a time. It's very popular for network printers. So if you have more of a communal network style printer, those are the two different types. Now, why it's important is because this year, although we're only in April, we've actually had two huge releases of fixes. And the reason why I mentioned this is quite important is because in the past, we've had the print nightmare. If you're familiar, about a year ago, we had printer driver issues where generic printer drivers were being updated, and that did cause printer issues with specific models. We learned it was a specific model to start with, and then it expanded into lots of other models, and then it became more generic. Any printer could be impacted. Now, we'd like to make a mention, because although we haven't seen any issues in March, Patch Tuesday, from any of our own testing that we did or any feedback we had from our thousands of customers, but that doesn't mean that we got away with it. We do recommend highly to test these printer drivers on a series or a sample of your environment that can cover both desktop printing and network printing, just to make sure that you're not going to cause any energy disruption or outage, because the worst of the issues we saw under the print nightmare was a blue screen when you tried to print. So please be aware, if you're in hospitality, retail, potentially even in healthcare, where you will be doing a lot of printing. I know a lot of those organizations or types of organizations do a lot of printing. Please make sure that you do some extra testing, just to make sure that there aren't any issues observed like we saw before. Now, we have 9 are more likely to be weaponized. That comes directly from Microsoft. We're going to talk more about those in a moment. One of those is in fact weaponized, and I'll explain what the difference is between weaponized and public aware very shortly. We do have 3 jump points. So a jump point is where a vulnerability can be exposed in one of the technologies, and then it's able to jump to another technology. So in this scenario, you might be able to expose hypervisor from Microsoft Hyper-V. Maybe you could jump from the host to the guest, or vice versa. In this scenario, we had 3 jump points that were for Office 365 click to run. So it was the Office 365 click to run. So effectively, if you're able to expose the click to run technology on Office, you can break out of that platform into another platform. The CVSS score and the severity wasn't very high, but we're still going to highlight those in our recommendations, as we understand Office is very popular. Now, just as I mentioned, the PostScript and the PCL6 print drivers, the particular vulnerability that they're addressing is an authenticated attacker with normal privileges, that's just a standard user, could send a modified XPS file to a shared printer, which then can result in a remote code execution. So this is something that can happen across any network, as long as they're able to send that file to the shared printer to cause the vulnerability. Obviously, we want to make sure that it gets patched so you don't have any exposure in your environment. So then we talk about our bug types. We've covered this several times, and we've got loads of feedback really about how important it is to understand the type of fixes that are released by Microsoft, because depending on the type of bug that we're fixing, it can actually change how you may prioritize your patches in your release strategy. And what is quite important is the entire of this year, as we've gone through this year, the remote code execution vulnerability has been the highest release of fixes, whereas usually it's elevation of privilege. So this can indicate that through the Microsoft partnerships with their antivirus and other security partners, they're finding a lot more ransomware, and where ransomware is exposing existing vulnerabilities with the operating system. So they're paying a lot more attention to this, and they're obviously addressing a lot more fixes in each Patch Tuesday release. Now, the remote code execution vulnerability is a class of cyber attack in which attackers remotely execute commands to place malware or other malicious code on your computer or network. So I think that's pretty important. If you see any remote code execution vulnerabilities, you may decide to actually include that in your patching strategy, because these are typically the ones that can lead to a malware attack. Elevation of privilege is where a threat actor gains access to an employee's account, bypasses the proper authorization channel, and successfully grants themselves access to data they're not supposed to have. We had 20 of those fixed in this Patch Tuesday. Information disclosure vulnerability, we had 10 of those. That's when a program unintentionally reveals sensitive information. This has happened a couple of times this year already, where memory or CPU is able to, where you're able to extract the data from there, from the memory, to actually read what's going through the memory or the CPU at the time. Obviously, if you can divulge specific information such as user accounts or user password hashes, that can actually lead to a more severe attack and a bigger breach in your environment. So please keep an eye on those. Denial of service, that's an attack meant to disrupt you. That's basically stopping your device through the running of services or the shutting down of processes. We had 9 of those fixed. Security feature bypass, that's when an attacker bypasses the authentication mechanisms of a device to gain authorized access. We had 8 of those, and spoofing is right down at the bottom. Still pretty important. That's the act of disguise to communicate, disguising a communication or an identity, and that can sometimes be just as simple as an email pretending to be somebody else. Obviously, the list is in descending order, and we'll talk more about some of the vulnerabilities that are addressed under these different bug types quite soon. So if you are a Syxsense customer, we may have actually walked you through how to prioritize patches for deployment to resolve vulnerabilities. But if you're not, this is actually how we would recommend it. Now, this webinar series is an educational platform. It's not specific for Syxsense customers. It's for anyone, regardless of your patching tool. And you can use some of the things that we're going to cover today to help you prioritize the patches in your environment, regardless of the size. And we use 6 particular factors to help us make that decision. So it's not just somebody's deciding that one is more important than another. It is a risk-based calculation, which what we call a SIX score. The first 2 is the severity of a vulnerability. We use the vendor's own severity as the original source of truth, and then we add to that to make sure that it is independent and accurate for you to effectively sign off the deployment for the month. So the vendor severity runs from critical, high, medium, and low, and as it goes down, it obviously gets less important. What is interesting is the vendors don't often change the severity once they're originally released. So please be aware that that can sometimes happen, but it's very rare. And then we compare it against the CVSS score, which is an independent score out of 10 that is based on, it's quite a sophisticated calculation So it is actually a calculator, and it's online, and you can look at that. CVSS 3.1, the calculator is online, and basically it walks you through what has to happen in order for that particular vulnerability to be exposed. It gives you scenarios about how much of your environment could be exposed in the manner of which data could be taken, or whether it's a denial of service, or whether it's a full breach. That calculation goes in and you get a score out of 10, 10 being the very worst, going all the way down to 0, which is the very least. Now, when you put the two together, you get somewhat of an independent assessment to the severity of which you should prioritize your patches. And a lot of customers that are using many different patch management tools aren't able to do a full wide environmental rollout simply because of the amount of data that's being transferred. So some customers use a ring style approach where they would target the very worst patches first, and then they will go down through the severities to ensure that they have enough of the patches covered in any month without disrupting end users. So when you combine the two of these together, you get an idea about what you should prioritize. And if you're using Syxsense, you of course can deploy them all together. We have some pretty good peer-to-peer technology that allows an efficient download of those patches. But then we need to add to this, because we can't just use the vendor severity and then an independent score by themselves. We want to add to this external factors that could actually influence how we prioritize an update. And we call these the state of the vulnerability. There are two states. The first one is called a weaponized state. And this means that, again, through the vendor partnerships and with the antivirus companies around the world, they get together, they identify that, yes, a vulnerability has been exposed, and they highlight exactly which of the CVEs was used to breach. If there is evidence of a weaponization, or sometimes it's called an active exploit, it obviously increases the risk of this being exploited in your environment. So we like to use the weaponized state as one of the many factors to identify that you have the patches being deployed in your environment that could impact your environment. Second, we have public aware. Public aware means that the precise method to exploit is available on the internet. It doesn't, however, mean that it is being weaponized. Sometimes you do get weaponized that is public aware, and often not. So white hat hackers, bug bounty programs, they may go to a vendor and say, hey, I found this vulnerability that can be exploited. Will you resolve it? If you don't resolve it in 30 days, I'll make the data public. Sometimes those vendors will look at that particular vulnerability and say, it's very, very difficult to exploit it, so we're not going to prioritize a patch for another couple of months. But I wouldn't want to be the IT manager that knew something was public aware. Even if it wasn't weaponized, I wouldn't want to not take the risk. I would want to deploy that public aware vulnerability. I'd rather have prepared a rollout of it than actually not think I needed to do it and get an exploit. That would be pretty bad. Lastly, we have some things that can influence how quickly we roll this out. We call those countermeasures, and countermeasures exist in two types. We have a mitigation. So we have, like, a highly sophisticated antivirus, for example, mitigates the need to roll out this update. You might have environments that are impacted on premise domains, but you don't have a premise domain you're using AD or Azure. In this scenario, you're mitigated against it. You don't need to roll the update. Then you have workarounds. So you might be able to deploy a registry key, or maybe go into a group policy and change something. And that effectively negates the need to roll out this update. Imagine some of these updates actually are 1.5 gigabytes or even more, and you can't do that quickly in a highly distributed environment, especially if you've got change control. So in this scenario, take a look at the list. If there are countermeasures available, you may be able to implement those countermeasures. That means you don't have to so urgently roll out the update. Just one thing to note, if you have implemented countermeasures, please read the notes on the patch itself and find out if you should reverse those countermeasures after you've deployed the patch. You shouldn't leave registry keys existing just because a patch has been deployed. You need to make sure that if the vendor recommends you remove those keys, you remove those keys once you've deployed the patch. And if you're using Syxsense, you can use some of our hyper automation techniques to deploy the patch and change the registry keys. And finally, it's your exposure. Your exposure, of course, has to be one of the most important aspects that drive the priority of urgency. So if you have a vendor severity critical CVSS score 10 weaponized and public aware on only a few of your devices, but you have a weaponized vulnerability that currently isn't vendor critical or CVSS score 10 exposed on 90% of your environment, I would want to obviously prioritize the second one. You put everything together and everything helps to calculate your element of risk. So your exposure is pretty important. So even if you're not a Syxsense customer, take the CVEs from our recommendation, pop them into your tool set, and obviously the more that you're exposed in this list, the higher the priority that you should deploy. Now let's go take a look at some of the analysis we've done for Patch Tuesday. As if you're familiar with this format, we don't actually make you sit on a slide deck. We actually do put everything directly onto our website. I'll just bring that across now. So if you head across to syxsense.com, you'll find our homepage where you've got this resources section. The resources section, we have all of our educational pages here, like our resource page, any news, any of our events that we're running, because we do like to offer a lot of education to the industry. If you want to see what Syxsense is about, you can schedule a demo up here, or if you have any questions about a patching strategy that might be right for you, even if you're not a Syxsense customer, use the chat function down here. You can ask for our ebook and our white papers on best practice and testing strategies, things like that. We'll send those across to you. If you head over to our resource center, you'll also find a lot more topics than just patch management, such as zero trust. If you're using zero trust, we'd love to talk to you. We'd love to see how you're using zero trust in your organization. Are you just learning about it, or are you actually implementing it already? We'd love to talk to you and meet with you at Black Hat or any of those other events that we're running, just to see how things are going. But most importantly, while you're here, we're going to be talking about Patch Tuesday. Now, each and every Patch Tuesday, we add one of these pages up. If you'd like, you can subscribe to this so that you can get the email every single time we put one of these up, and you can get our write-up a little bit sooner than the webinar. So let's go through what we've got. This is while you're here. So we got, as I said, about 100 updates this month. A few things I want to make to point out, which is quite interesting because I do a lot of analysis of what actually comes out. We had a lot of fixes, but it doesn't appear to be many areas of Windows that have been fixed. So we have Microsoft Windows components, Office and Office components, Windows Defender, SharePoint, Hyper-V, that printer issue I mentioned, and Microsoft Dynamics. Not a lot else. So a lot of those fixes must be for the printer issues that I mentioned already in those Office updates. That's pretty interesting. But that still doesn't mean you've got your lead off. And just want to highlight Windows Defender. I get a lot of messages from people that come to the webinar and say, "Oh, we don't use Windows Defender. We don't need to prioritize it. It's a vulnerability that we're effectively mitigated against." That might be true if you're using another antivirus tool. However, we do know that sometimes antivirus tools need updates, and those antivirus updates can sometimes fail, and that update can leave you without an antivirus of the antivirus that you're using in your organization. The Windows 10 and the Windows 11 default is to automatically turn on the Windows Defender in the event that there are no other protection tools on the device. And if you haven't been patching them, then effectively you're turning on a Windows Defender antivirus that hasn't been updated and potentially isn't best able to defend your device against ransomware. So please give that a thought. Just even though you're not using it, it still is important that you try to keep those up to date. We have a weaponized vulnerability we'll talk about in a second. That's the Windows Common Log File System driver. That's actually come around a couple of times. I've got some more notes on that one. But I just want to give you some background into what we found about the CVSS score. Now, I mentioned that we got about 100 updates fixed. To put that into perspective, if I count all the CVSS scores that were fixed in this release, it actually is 722.4. So that's the individual score. If we add all the CVSSs up, last month, where we had just 30 updates less, that actually went down to 529. So a massive increase in the higher severity vulnerabilities fixed in this release, not just a number of fixes, but more severe as well. So please be aware, if you're not using CVSS as a priority, please ensure you do so. Here are my priorities. First one is CVE 2023-28252. This is the Windows Common Log File System Driver elevation of privilege. Now, in February, as I mentioned, this one has been released and fixed a couple of times, which kind of tells me that they haven't quite got to the root cause of it. This type of exploit is typically paired with a code execution bug to spread malware, ransomware. Definitely one to test and deploy. This one, if exploited, could gain system privileges. As I mentioned, this is weaponized, but it's interesting. It only has a vendor severity of important and a CVSS score of 7.8. So it's one of the ones that you may not have included had I not mentioned it just today. My second one is actually a pair of vulnerabilities very similar to each other. CVE 2023-21554. This is the Microsoft Message Queuing remote code execution vulnerability. Microsoft is saying that this is more likely to be exploited. This is the Windows Message Queuing service, which is a Windows component. And if it is enabled, it can be exploited. It can be exploited over any network, including the internet. So if your device has access to the internet, this can actually be exploited with low attack complexity, no privileges, and no user interaction. Luckily, it does not have a jump point, but it is one of those vulnerabilities that has a CVSS of 9.8 and a vendor severity of critical. Pretty serious. And then lastly, my third pick for today is CVE 2023-28250. This is the Windows Pragmatic General Multicast, known as PGM, remote code execution vulnerability, and I didn't know what that was. So I did some research and I realized why it's so important. So the Pragmatic General Multicast, PGM, is a reliable multicast computer network transport protocol. PGM provides a reliable sequence of packets to multiple recipients simultaneously, making it suitable for application like multi-receiver file transfer. That's like peer-to-peer technology or any other tools that you're using to share files from one device to many or from many to one. This has a CVSS score of 9.8 with a vendor severity of critical. It can be exposed across any network with low attack complexity, no privileges, no user interaction, and luckily it doesn't have a jump point. What I've done is I've taken all of the other vulnerabilities that were released yesterday. I've paired them up in priority order from highest priority to least priority. We have details about the impact, the severity, the CVSS. Please go through, take the CVE from here, pop it into your tool set, and remediate as quickly as you can following your testing. I'd like to thank you very much for joining me today, and from everyone at Syxsense. I hope this was really useful, and until next month, I wish you happy patching. Thank you.